Let's come back to order. And I want to welcome our guests today from NWAC, from the Native Women's Association of Canada. We're very pleased that you've been able to make time to come and join us today. We look forward to hearing everything that you have to say and to learn from you. With us today are Dawn Lavelle-Harvard, the president of NWAC, and Dan Peters, the acting executive director. And just before I turn the floor over to you, Dawn and Dan, I wanted to let you know about the process that we have in place. So we're going to give you 10 minutes to present. We have an hour all in all between now and we finish up at 5:30. You'll have 10 minutes. Then we're going to go into rounds of questions from the committee members that are fairly strictly timed. At the first round of questions are 7 minutes long. If we make it into the second round, they'll be 5 minutes long. But in order to ensure fairness, I will be cutting people off, including you, at 10 minutes. So I'm apologizing in advance if I'm rude, but it really is the only way that we can ensure fairness and that we get people onto their responsibilities that await after 5:30. So if you're ready, I welcome you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, because that was actually going to be my first question, was at what point do you cut me off?
Okay. I'll show you a yellow card at 1 minute left, and then the red card means please conclude your sentence. All right.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. I want to thank you for this opportunity to address you here today. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting here on the Algonquin territory, the traditional Indigenous peoples in this area. The Native Women's Association of Canada is founded on the collective goal to enhance, promote, and foster the social, economic, cultural, and political well-being of Indigenous women in Canada. NWAC is an aggregate of 13 Native women's organizations from across Canada and was incorporated as a non-profit organization in 1974. Back in the 1970s, when our women were struggling to be reinstated to their communities, women who were removed from their communities because of the gender discrimination, the sex discrimination in the Indian Act, when an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she was removed from the community, received a check from the government for $12 and a letter that said, "You're no longer an Indian." That meant she no longer had the right to live in her community, no longer had the right to even return to her community without permission, lost her land, her home, the right to be buried in that community. It was this clear gender discrimination that organized our women. Our women have been activists at the community level for generations, starting with homemakers clubs, where to the outsiders it looked, they spread the image that they were there to trade recipes and talk about stain removal and laundry. But they were there behind closed doors to talk about how to better the lives in their communities. And this was the beginning of a very long tradition. When our women went all the way to the Supreme Court over what eventually became Bill C-31, they actually lost at the Supreme Court level. But this was our experience where we realized that the voice of our women in our communities had been silenced, that Indian Act governments, band councils and chiefs had superseded our traditional forms of governments, had silenced the voice of our women, and that was why our associations were created, and we are now the modern incarnation of those traditional Indigenous women's councils that happened in our traditions all across the country, those circles where our women had equality, our women had voice in our communities. So we're the contemporary incarnation of our traditional women's councils, or grandmothers' lodges, the clan mothers, depending on which nation you arise from. We as the aunties, mothers, sisters, and daughters collectively recognize, respect, promote, and defend our ancestral laws, spiritual beliefs, languages, and traditions, but most importantly, our families and our nations. We are the voice of Aboriginal women, in part because many national, provincial, and local organizations do not have defined or well-developed avenues to allow Aboriginal women's voices to be heard. Since we were founded in 1974, we have fostered trust, we have listened to our women, and we have created the forums and the venues for our women to have their voices heard. Our ability to listen has generated many positive outcomes, including Bill C-31, after we lost at the Supreme Court here in Canada, going to the international human rights watchdogs, the international human rights laws, to make sure that our women were treated with equality. And as a result, tens of thousands of Indigenous women and children were reinstated to their communities. But this gender discrimination is still continuing because they were not given back their original status. They were put back as reinstatees, and many communities and still, in fact, refuse to accept the women and children back to their communities. So we're still facing this ongoing discrimination simply because we're Indigenous women. We have been working since we began on bringing to light the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. We've been working to bring to light the issue of the extremely high levels of violence that our women and girls face, both in our communities. Fleeing violence is the #1 reason our women leave the communities. Not for an education, not for a job, to find somewhere they can be safe. Unfortunately, many of our women, when they enter into the urban settings, having left their communities, they find that because of the additional racism, they're even less safe. They're slipping through the cracks because of systemic racism. This issue has been brought to light not only in Canada, but on the international forums. And as we all know, we are now heading into the national inquiry. And despite being consistently underfunded from our inception, we have brought this human rights crisis that we're facing here in Canada, to the international attention. We have done this collectively with our history of strength and our capacity to listen, act, and inform our women. We have many priorities. Many of the issues and challenges for our women and girls exist and are all related to this history of oppression, dispossession, and the imposition of a foreign governance on our communities that replaced our traditional role as women. It's very difficult when we're looking at the issue of violence to determine there is no one easy answer. It's a complex web of poverty that is making our women unsafe. Our women are not vulnerable. They are put in circumstances where they become vulnerable because of broken treaties, because of communities that are living in third world conditions. It's not about choosing a high-risk lifestyle. We've heard this conversation many, many times, that Indigenous women and girls are going missing or are being murdered because of high-risk lifestyles. And we agree that our women have high-risk lifestyles, not because they chose a high-risk lifestyle, but it's because of lack of choice, because of lack of opportunity when you're in a community that doesn't have clean water, when you're in a community that doesn't have schools, that doesn't have housing, that doesn't have many of the basic things we see as human rights here in Canada, living in third world conditions in the middle of one of the richest countries in the world. This is why ending violence against our women is our #1 priority, because you cannot focus on your education. You cannot write a paper when you cannot go home at night because it's not safe. How do you apply for a job when you're trying to cover the black eyes and the bruises? How do you keep your family together when you have no housing and children welfare? You don't want to report because the first consideration is they're going to take the children out of the home because they believe it's unsafe. All of these factors are going together and tearing our families apart, putting our women in danger. And this should not be happening because this has been identified very clearly as a grave human rights violation against Indigenous women and girls here in Canada. So we need to continue to focus, #1, on ending the violence, on making sure our women and girls have safety so that we can focus on that empowerment and building the capacity, the employment and education, begin to address the over-incarceration of our women who are being thrown into prison and doing time for stealing food to feed their families. 30 days for stealing food. And of course, you know that means that that woman's child ends up in child welfare, and the cycle goes on. And it starts with the next generation. The mental health issues, because of the ongoing issues of violence, because of the lack of follow-up and healing from residential schools, from the 60 scoop, from the ongoing trauma, and not to mention the post-traumatic stress of living consistently with this experience of violence. We've heard the crisis that has been declared because of the high level of suicide attempts. This community that has had 11 suicide attempts last Saturday is just one of the many communities that is struggling with this issue. We have to address the mental health, maternal child health, diabetes, health conditions, housing, poverty, environmental concerns. Indigenous women have the role since time immemorial as the carriers of water, as the protectors of the water because of our role as women and the givers of life. And we need to make sure that as Indigenous women, as one of the national Aboriginal organizations, that we have fought hard to get a seat at the table to make sure the voices of our women and children are heard. And we're very concerned right now that we have seen the potential that our voices are going to be silenced yet again, pushed back from the table, and we say we cannot let this happen. We have struggled too long to get a seat at the table. We have struggled too long to hold our families and our communities together. But the fact that we're still here shows that we can declare victory because we have survived, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dawn. We're going to move right into the questioning, and we start with in the 7-minute question round with Michael McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. You've described a condition that many communities in my riding are facing, and I welcome the opportunity to talk to the NBT, Native Women's Association. And we talked about a number of different things, and some of the issues were very startling to me. And we need to find solutions in a lot of different areas. One of the things that we discussed was the legal system in the north, at least, is very complicated and, for the most part, confusing to people that are in distress and are seeking assistance, and to have the justice system on their side, to be reassured that they can deal with the issue at hand. A lot of times the system is too complicated, and the women will just throw their hands up in the air and give up and go back into a community or a relationship that is a lot of times not safe and of high risk, as you had stated yourself. And they really pointed to the need for an advocate or an ombudsman to help them as they enter to the system. They also talked a lot about the lack of resources to deal with programs to help individuals that come into the larger centers and to refer them. I got several questions, but my first question is, can you talk a little bit about your funding? Can you talk a little bit about the resources that you have to operate with, and how that's either grown over the last years or shrunk or reduced, or maybe give us a snapshot of what you have to work with?
Okay, so in fact, our resources, our capacity to deliver the support needed by the families has shrunk considerably over the last years. We have been one of the hardest hit Aboriginal organizations by recent funding cuts over the last 3 or 4 years. We are well behind what we were even 10 years ago because of the cuts. I think Dan can have some numbers.
Yeah, we've, like well behind. When I first started at NWAC 8 years ago, we had, there's a whole suite of programs, health programs we had. I was back in the time when they had NAHO, and we had the Aboriginal Suicide Prevention Program, Maternal Child Health, Diabetes, and a number of other programs that, really, supported Indigenous women, and all the NAOs received that funding, but that was cut from FNIB or Health Canada. So right now, we have some CIHR funding through the PEAK program, which is the Prevention, Education, Action, Change, and Evaluation. So it's to create safety nets for Aboriginal women. And we also have some labor market development funding from ESDC. And the PEAK program, I think I mentioned it, but also we have some status from the Peace Project funding. But as far as INAC goes, there's ARO funding, which is the Aboriginal Representative Organization funding envelope. And it's kind of a competitive process to get that money. And there were some, I'm not 100% sure how much, but I think it was around 76 million over 5 years for, that was in the budget. So, we haven't heard about getting that. We have a few projects, an entrepreneurship network that we've been doing for the past few years, and actually a project called Activating Social Change and Project Uplift. So we have a few projects from INAC. We also received some core funding, which, what Don was talking about, we just, we don't really have the capacity to do a lot of things, like, to have someone in communications, especially with the inquiry going on and the pre-inquiry. We need, an increase in core funding. I believe we get $560,000 a year, which, is just a pittance considering the work that we do. We need more core funding, and that's something we're definitely, striving to do.
Thank you for that. In the Northwest Territories, we have a few safe houses and shelters, not very many. They're usually just in the regional centers, and we don't have any alcohol treatment center or any treatment centers or facilities of that nature. So a lot of times, individuals in the community, including women, will turn to the Aboriginal organizations, the Friendship Center, the Band Councils, the Métis Nation, or the Native Women's. Now, I've talked to every one of these organizations, and their budgets have been cut to where they really can't function. They're almost up to a point where they're looking at maybe closing their doors. So there's still a lot of big issues out there. So what do you do in the case of gender discrimination? I've heard a lot of discussion on this in my talks. If somebody goes to you and says that the wages are not on par with men in the same field, or there is in a certain field, a certain sector, they're only hiring men. Where do you refer people? What do you do with these people that are coming to you if you don't have the resources to deal with them yourself?
Well, exactly. This is specifically the problem we're dealing with. We have been cut to the point where we can't function in many of the areas that women are still coming to us. When they don't get what they need in the community, when families have been missing and murdered, they will call the national office. And it very often means that because we cannot, in good conscience, ever turn somebody away and say, no, we're not funded to do that. I have been on the phone for hours with social workers trying to sort out somebody's disability check as the president, making sure that that gets done. I have been with the Human Rights Council in the province that we've worked with to make sure things get done. And as always, it's those with the least resources and the least capacity who are expected to shoulder the burden of these cuts. And we will continue to do what we can, but it's heartbreaking to have to turn to tell somebody that, we're trying to do this off the side of the desk, or having to try to refer when there should be the resources there so that when women come forward, when they're in danger, that they know that they can count on us to advocate and to do something for them. And right now, if that means I have to do it personally on my time off, then that's what we've had to do.
Thanks, Don. We'll have to leave it there. David Yurtica, please.
Well, thank you for being here today. Obviously, this is a great concern for everyone around this table, and actually everywhere in Canada, because this is a significant issue that we have to address. And what role does the NWAC play in supporting provincial and territorial women's organizations, Aboriginal women's organizations? So you guys have a lot of organizations underneath you. So what role do you play? Is it financial support? Is it also a knowledge-based support? And how's that broken down?
Okay, actually, we would like to provide more support for the provincial associations. Right now, we have been working on trying to foster partnerships. When we're at the Council of the Federations, for example, and the provinces are talking about their commitment to Indigenous peoples, when they're talking about their commitment to ending violence against Indigenous women, starting to say, what are you doing in your province and territory to support your provincial association? How do we build that partnership and trying to foster that? Because we have consistently applied year after year after year for funds and resources to be able to support provincial associations. We have consistently been denied, but we have tried to work around that with that sort of knowledge sharing to help the provincial associations, if it's a competitive proposal basis, helping them to develop better proposals, because we know proposal processes always end up with those who have the money continue to get more money because they have the capacity to write the good proposals, and those who have not had a chance to get in the door never get a chance to get in the door because they don't have the capacity to write the proposals. So this is creating severe inequality province by province, and when you see provinces where the province has a commitment to ending violence, a commitment to supporting Indigenous people, I know Ontario has made huge commitments to ending violence. The recent announcement of $100 million, they provide core funding for their provincial association. They have a facility. They have tremendous support. But then you'll see other provinces where there's nothing, where they're struggling, and we're supporting them so that they can have an office. And this is clear inequality across the province. And we need to, with this inquiry, we need to make sure that the provinces and the federal government, when everybody is talking about genuine relationships and genuine collaboration, that means we have to make sure that all of the partners have the capacity to participate in that relationship and not be the poor cousin who has the right to be at the table but doesn't have even the gas money to get there.
Okay, thank you. And another thing, we talk a little bit about the inadequate funding. And, our ability to do a good job requires a certain amount of money. And I don't know what your current budget is. What is your ideal budget to carry out your mandate? Is it short by 50%? So we get an idea exactly what the shortfall is.
We would have to be at least double where we're at now. We have been cut back so much that we are operating at less than half of what we need. And that is just to meet minimum standards, minimum emergency crisis when people come to our door, not to even get to the kind of larger long-term capacity building, sustainability, talking about advocates and the system. This is one of the fundamental problems. There are many resources and supports out there, but even for well-educated people who have significant resources, phones, internet, all of these things, it's very difficult to navigate all of the very many systems. And so often dollars go unspent. Resources are not accessed because the number of hoops that have to get through. We have a center in Thunder Bay where they have brought together workers in one building, where one worker is for housing, one worker is for child welfare, one worker is for the Healthy Babies Initiative. And it's a model that we've had these community hubs where when a woman and her children come in, if you come in for employment, but then we find out you have nowhere to sleep tonight, we walk down the hall together. And so having this kind of wraparound care in every province would help us to work to end the violence, to build that capacity, to make sure that an investment in a woman always results in long-term improvement for the entire family and community, because that increases the chances of those children having a better outcome, of having increased education and employment later in life. So significant upstream investments for us to be able to just meet the demand that's out there right now would be double our current budget. But to actually start making improvements and significant long-term improvements in the lives of Indigenous women and children, we would have to be at minimum 4 times what we're at now. And that we also have to build the capacity in the provincial associations.
Okay, thank you. I understand there's a portion of it is federal, portion is provincial. Does First Nations play any part in financial contributions to your organization?
Okay, so just to be clear, the Native Women's Association of Canada only gets federal funding. Our provincial affiliates, to varying degrees, get provincial funding. As to my current knowledge, we don't get any funding through any First Nations for any of our provincial affiliates or programs at either the national or the provincial level.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies for me, because I didn't know how you guys were funded. So strictly federal, and
Association of Canada, yes.
1 minute. Okay, I got a quick question here. Your organization has been very active since 1974, and can you highlight some of your accomplishments that we can take back and say this is what they have completed? This is some of the programs that we instituted to make lives for our Aboriginal women better.
Absolutely. I think Bill C-31 was one of our first and most significant accomplishments. That was our rallying call where women got together so that that Indigenous women had the right to be Indigenous, that we had a right to be members of our communities and to be who we were, and to regain that was carried on later to the next generation with Sharon MacIver and the MacIver decision that allowed then the next generation to have the right to be Indigenous, to have a right to be members of their First Nation communities. That's a huge accomplishment. But also, I think one of our largest accomplishments has been the result of 30-year struggle to bring attention to the issue of violence, something that nobody wanted to talk about, nobody wanted to hear. They wanted to, this notion that when economic development was dealt with, that the violence wouldn't be a problem. So it was a struggle just to start having those conversations. And the fact that the Sisters in Spirit initiative, even if we had to go to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to get an investigation, to have them here in Canada, to have the human rights violation identified and exposed and ultimately will be hopefully dealt with, the same thing with the United Nations, to be using those kinds of international human rights protocols to shine a light and expose the human rights violations here in Canada is, I don't know whether you want an accomplishment, but that has made significant difference and has catapulted us into this process of we are now at the very first steps of making long-term change by addressing that violence.
Thanks. Nikki Ashton, who's substituting for committee member Charlie Angus, please.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Ms. Lavelle Harvard, for joining us today and to speak to the important work that the Native Women's Association of Canada does. And I think obviously you gave a very powerful synopsis of the extent of NWAC's contributions to Indigenous women, Indigenous communities, but also Canadian society. And I do want to highlight the work as well of Sisters in Spirit. It continues to be an organization or an effort rather that despite the fact that its funding was entirely cut, it is still in people's psyche and certainly brings people together and continues to bring people together. Families that were first reunited through Sisters in Spirit work continue to come together and be powerful voices on the need ultimately for justice for Indigenous women. I'm wondering, looking ahead, and I know your presentation touched on it a bit. Obviously, we're all very supportive of the work that's being undertaken to bring forward a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. But one of the things that I hear a lot from Indigenous women and Indigenous men as well in communities across northern Manitoba and across Canada is that the inquiry is critical, it needs to take place, but there are certain actions that can take place prior to the inquiry. And one of the words that you use to describe the reality that many Indigenous peoples face is that of poverty. And obviously, how that really is linked to the marginalization and the vulnerability that many Indigenous peoples experience right now. I'm wondering, do you agree that fundamental actions need to take place, in parallel to the inquiry? I mean, do we need to wait for the inquiry to tackle poverty in Indigenous communities, or can we go forward, and should we be going forward on that front as soon as possible?
I think we've made it very clear on a number of occasions that, while absolutely it's important that we have this inquiry in order to articulate and identify long-term upstream investments, the nature of the racialized, sexualized violence and systemic discrimination that has put our people in danger, we've been very, very clear that there are many things we can do right now, and that should be done, because we cannot afford to wait 2, 3, 4 years for recommendations down the road while girls continue to go missing every week, while women continue to be murdered every week. We can't afford to wait. There was plenty of recommendations. There's many things we know we can do right now. Transportation on the Highway of Tears, that needs to be dealt with right away. We need to look at pilot projects for exiting programs for women who want to get off the streets. We have women in BC who have come forward wanting to have these kind of supports so that it's not a perpetual revolving door. Improvement in the child welfare, very clearly, the equality issues. We're talking about generations over the time frame of an inquiry. That's an entire childhood in a community. That is that individual human being's entire childhood while they wait for incremental equality. Children deserve better now, and absolutely it has to start right away.
Thank you very much. I also noted that in the report that NWAC released, one of the recommendations with regards to the inquiry, one of the recommendations was for a comprehensive national action plan, and that's a discussion that I've been involved with for years, and certainly was very closely involved in the previous Parliament. But of course, this discussion continues to be ongoing as to what that comprehensive national action plan ought to include. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that from NWAC's position.
From NWAC's position, we're very clear that our people are too important to be trapped in jurisdictional issues where responsibility for ending violence is bounced back and forth between federal government, provincial government, local communities. So we're wanting to see a national action plan where all of the players, all of those who have responsibility for improving the conditions for Indigenous families and Indigenous nations are at that table, engaging in a genuine, collaborative, participatory development of an action plan. And that's really key. Not something that is handed to us to rubber stamp, where we have to backtrack and fix a model or ideas, something where we are involved in a genuine collaborative development of an action plan that includes addressing those root causes, addressing the poverty, addressing the child welfare issues, supports we talked about for addictions, for treatment. All of these situations are contributing to the violence, and we need to be addressing them in a much more integrated way. It's not only frustrating for those on the ground who are trying to make a difference, it's fiscally irresponsible to be operating in silos and across jurisdictional boundaries and then claiming we don't have the budget to make the significant upstream investments, because it's just not efficient to be operating in that way. If we're talking about ending violence, that means everybody. That means housing, that means education, that means health, that means corrections, that means justice, that means cops. There are so many players that have a role in this, and it's just not efficient to be operating in separate fields. So that needs to be integrated, collaborative, and I can't say enough, co-developed right from the start so that we're not wasting time correcting things down the path, that we're doing it right the first time.
Okay.
Piece of it.
And I'm wondering if we could just go back to the reference to poverty. How important do you feel that it's important to not just eliminate or reduce, but eliminate poverty in Indigenous communities?
Absolutely. Poverty is one of the main contributors to the lack of safety for Indigenous women and Indigenous children and families. Poverty is one of the main contributors to the loss of life, to the loss of future generations. And there's no excuse for that kind of poverty in one of the richest countries in the world, where we have entire communities that are living in third world conditions, that this cannot be allowed to continue for another generation. We need to address, this is upstream investments so that we're saving money in the long run, investing in education, employment, and the eradication of poverty, so we're not having to spend triple the money on prisons and treatment.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Don Rusnak, please.
So thank you for coming today. I know a little bit of the work that NWAC does and the affiliate of the Ontario Native Women's Association in Thunder Bay. You mentioned a project in Thunder Bay, and I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on that. I'm a real fan of collaboration and partnerships, and I know from my time in the criminal justice system, both in Alberta and in Thunder Bay, that a lot of the supports weren't there for women, and I know in Thunder Bay the services that the Ontario Native Women's Association provide there very, very helpful to women in the community. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that partnership in Thunder Bay for the benefit of the committee members and other individuals here that perhaps they would want to look at partnerships like that in their communities and getting them off the ground?
Absolutely. The Thunder Bay Centre for the Ontario Native Women's Association is looking at that wraparound model where we're bringing the partners. Many of the things we do, we have partnerships with not only First Nations, but with the Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, with the Métis Nation of Ontario, so that whether it be the housing corporation, so that we can provide housing, whether it be employment and training initiatives, whether it be the health outreach workers. Very often our workers will have a family, the women and her children, and they take them on as clients, the entire family. And if it means our worker goes with them to court, we go with them to court. If it means we go with them to the housing office, we go with them there, to really make sure that these families are getting the maximum supports, that they're not just being bounced and told you need to go across town. And I don't know how many of you are parents, but if you have ever tried as a parent to get 3 little kids ready in the morning, get to an appointment only to get there and be told you missed this one thing and now you have to go across town to get something else, very often people give up. And those kinds of systemic hoops are the reasons many people don't get the services that they need and the services that they're entitled to. And that's why having those supports, having that person with you who knows what your rights are, who knows what services are out there and can facilitate that wraparound model to make sure we're not losing clients, we're not losing families because of lack of understanding, when there is lots of opportunity out there, lots of partnerships, has been very successful in holding families together and addressing poverty. If their kids are going to be taken away because they have no housing, we get them housing. Rather than paying triple the amount, thousands of dollars to put those children in foster homes. How about we get that family food? How about we get those children jackets? It's the kind of common sense solutions that can be found if we're working in partnerships.
And a follow-up for that, or to that question, benefit again for my colleagues, is there any other partnerships across the country that can be used as a model to help women in distress or women in these situations? As an example, to other cities and other communities in my colleagues' ridings. Any other examples?
Actually, what I would really like to do is extend an open invitation to anybody who would like to come to the Thunder Bay and look at the model, look at the wraparound services, look at the partnerships that are being done there to facilitate. I can't speak exactly to the other partnerships that are in other provinces because each province is autonomous and they work on developing within their own regions. But we know moving forward that we have to become more engaged with what we call, cops, courts, and corrections. We have to start doing a better job with the justice area so that our families in the future are not shying away from the authorities. Because very often, when you reach out for help, when a woman realizes maybe she has an addictions issue and requires treatment, reaching out to the authorities if there's violence in the home often results in your children being taken away. And many women would rather continue to experience the violence than lose their kids. And that results in yet another generation, and we can't break the cycle if we don't address to make sure that when women reach out, and that requires separating prevention and support from those who will apprehend. And that's a really key, it's a new innovative way of thinking about how we create partnerships and using community grassroots partnerships to provide the supports rather than those who are tasked, unfortunately, with removing children as their obligation.
I'm just going to switch gears a little bit here, and the recently released report by ANWAC recommends that a national inquiry be independent from government, adequately funded and free of legal time or funding restrictions that will impede its ability to effectively address the scope and nature of the problem. Can you elaborate on how a national inquiry can be independent from government, along with any advantages or disadvantages associated with this approach?
So there's legal ways that they can set up the inquiry so that it has authority, that it is not being directed by any specific department, making sure that it is truly arm's length so that it's not beholden to exactly somebody's department. The concerns that we've seen in the past inquiry, specifically in BC, was with regard to the fact that even though civil organizations such as the Native Women's Association of Canada were given standing in the inquiry, we had the right to go to the inquiry to speak, and it's organizations such as the Native Women's Association, such as the Feminist Alliance for International Action, who have genuine independence because they are not constrained by being paid employees of the government, that to have that voice, but because they were not provided sufficient funding for legal counsel, sufficient funding to be able to attend the inquiry, meant that that voice was in effect silenced, and it significantly reduced the independence of the inquiry, because those who have the independent thought, the independent knowledge, and the grassroots ability to speak out were silenced because we were not able to get to the table. So that our rights are only as valid as our ability to exercise them. And having the right to be at the table means nothing if we can't get there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the questions, Don. We're moving to the 5-minute questions now, and Arnold Viersen is up.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your work, sharing the work that your organization does. It's clear that NWAC has made combating violence against Indigenous women and girls the primary focus of your work. And I liked how you highlighted at the beginning is that in order to eliminate poverty, we have to get rid of violence first. That's probably, if we can eliminate the violence, the poverty will be reduced in and of itself. When it comes to violence against women, there's one area that I'm particularly interested in hearing about that was raised by your organization 2 years ago at a Senate committee. And at that time, the NWAC urged that the impact of accessibility to online violent, sexual explicit material on youth, and especially boys, be at the forefront of our minds as parliamentarians. Could you share with the committee about why you believe this is on an issue that Parliament should examine and take action on?
Okay, so just to be clear, what I was pointing out was that this is a very vicious cycle, that ending violence helps to end poverty because it allows our women to get an education, to get employment, to take care of their families. At the same time, the poverty is contributing to the violence and the lack of safety. So it's an unfortunate never-ending cycle where poverty reproduces the violence and the violence reproduces the poverty. So I just wanted to be clear. As well as with the issue of online sexualized violent sexualized content, we have seen significant research that shows that generations now of young people and young boys specifically who are being exposed to explicit, violent, sexualized content that depicts the degradation and the dehumanization, objectification of women leads to increased violence. We need only look at the situation that happened with Cindy Gledoux to see one of the most extremely offensive, horrific atrocities that is the outcome of that kind of violent content. The fact that that perpetrator's computer content, which had hundreds of graphic, what could only be described as sexual torture, was not allowed to be considered as part of the charges, as part of the evidence for when the perpetrator brutally murdered Cindy Gledoux, who was then herself degraded and dehumanized by having her most vital body parts passed around the jury as evidence, shows exactly the kind of horrific outcome that happens when explicit sexual violent content imprints in young minds. And I think that we are really just beginning to see the outcome in this next generation of what is a very, very different environment. And as a mother and as the Native Women's Association, we know how many times children accidentally stumble onto some of the most horrifying sexual violence on the internet when they are innocently typing in something, I won't even, but to see that kind of long-term shaping of attitudes towards women and girls, which are based, and shaping of attitudes towards sex, and shaping of attitudes towards relationships that then become based on violence. We're seeing it more and more because of the violent content on the internet that increasingly higher numbers of young children are being exposed to.
45 seconds, Arnold.
All right. ANWAC has also worked to end violence towards women and girls who have been victims of sex trafficking. Do you see a link between the accessibility of violent sexual material and sex trafficking?
I think the availability of online violent sexual material contributes to the larger attitudes of the degradation and dehumanizing of women generally, but racialized and Indigenous women specifically, which contributes to trafficking, which contributes to a larger societal attitude that often blames the victim in these situations. So for young women, girls, the average age that they are recruited, that they are trafficked, is 13. So arguments that suggest that it's a choice, that the prostitution, when we are talking about the average age is 13, that means this is exploitation of children, and that human trafficking, we need to be very clear, is one of the outcomes of the larger attitudes that degrade and dehumanize Indigenous women specifically.
Thanks. Gary and Andisangri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lovell-Harvard and Mr. Peters for being here today. You mentioned earlier that women are being jailed for 30 days for stealing food just to survive. Very disturbing statistic shows that 35% of women in federal prisons are Aboriginal women. Now, I know it's a very large issue, but where are the challenges? I know the social challenges aside in terms of poverty and so on. Within the criminal justice system, is it is it issues like targeting by police? Is it poor prosecution, lack of diversion, lack of judiciary that reflects the community? Like where are we in the spectrum, and what are the challenges that we need to address? Because I think this number, in fact, has been growing over the last couple of decades.
Okay, so yes, and yes, that the Indigenous women, unfortunately, are the most over-policed, but yes, less likely to get justice. That our women are targeted, they're being monitored because of racial issues. The lack of criminal justice, I mean, we know that justice is very intimately connected to the representation you can purchase. So it's very intimately connected to poverty as well. If you don't have the funds to buy a lawyer, if you don't have the funds to get justice, then you're going to end up with the least favorable outcomes. They're going to end up in jail. And it was a really clear example when we were in Vancouver during the Stanley Cup riots, and there were young men coming in from the suburbs and lighting police cars on fire. And across the country, there's arguments about why this young man should not go to jail because he has a beautiful career ahead of him, a scholarship to some Ivy League university. And I mean, this was not a, boys will be boys. They were actually going to set police cars on fire. That's large-scale justice of damage and potential danger. And yet an Indigenous woman who, if somebody's got their hands around my throat, I'm going to fight back too. Real honest. And very often, many of our women end up in jail because they've stood up for themselves, because they have fought back in violent situations, and double charging means that they end up in jail too if he says he hit, she hit back. So we've seen again and again that our women are over-policed. Because of the high levels of violence, when women fight back, they end up in jail. Because of racism, because of lack of having Indigenous women in juries, because of court processes, our women don't get justice, and we get harsher sentences. And very often when Indigenous women end up in jail, one of the primary concerns we have is some women who go in for what is essentially a trivial charge because of things that happen while they're in jail can become indeterminate sentences. So somebody who goes in originally for stealing food for her family ends up doing a life sentence because they can give them indeterminate sentences because they have some small petty thing while they are in jail, such as throwing your papers at the parole committee, and then that's considered assault. We've seen it again and again where they've gone in initially for petty theft and end up with a life sentence.
On the issue of standing in the inquiry, the upcoming inquiry, what type of resources do you need as an organization in order to fully represent the issues that are at hand?
One of the things we've talked about with, in fact, the families have said they wanted the Sisters in Spirit initiative begun again. That was $2 million per year over 5 years because they relied on that Sisters in Spirit initiative. If a family member needed something, they called our office. These families know they are going to be moving into a time frame of potentially being re-traumatized, re-victimized. We saw this again and again in BC, and they have been asking us if we are going to be able to support them through this, if we're going to be there for them, because this is where they call the Sisters in Spirit to even have that ongoing data analysis, that support for the families. That is the fundamental first step that many families wanted, the Sisters in Spirit reinstated so that they have somewhere to go, that they have someone to support them and protect them and speak out for them in this process to make sure that the victims are not put on trial and re-traumatized through this process.
Kathy, you were Todd. Okay, the final question of the evening is from Todd Doherty on behalf of Kathy McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to first start off by saying thank you to Ms. Lavelle Harvard and Mr. Peters for being here today. Your passionate presentation can help but touch our hearts. I also like to say that I'm very proud to have two Indigenous women in my life, and that's the reason why I'm here today. And I'm very proud to say that. Ms. Lavelle Harvard, we've seen many studies and inquiries done over the years for the MMIW. You spoke about breaking the systemic cycle. This government, in their plan or their budget 2016, have announced that they're putting forward $40 million. I've read some of your recommendations, but what else can we do to ensure that we're leaving a legacy of action and not a legacy of books on shelves? And what other kind of mechanisms can we ensure that this money and any money that this government has put in place or has pledged is getting to those critical areas that it's intended for?
So I think this is something that necessitates long-term independent oversight, so that it's not just a family advisory while it's in everybody's eye because it's in the public view because we are going through the process of the inquiry. This requires a commitment to a funded, independent oversight who is going to have the kinds of human rights knowledge, the kinds of grassroots knowledge to be able to ensure that the government is held to task, that the international human rights watchdogs are continuing to look at this situation, because that's what's going to be really important here, that this isn't just a flash in the pan, that it's something that's checked off on a to-do list that we do the inquiry, and as you said, then it becomes one more report on a shelf that nobody ever looks at. That's going to mean that the inquiry itself has to have some commitment, and we're saying at minimum to a third phase. You have the pre-inquiry phase where they're developing, you have the actual inquiry, but a third phase that ensures that any identification of misconduct, of lack of justice, cases that need to be reopened, because they're not going to be able to reopen them during the inquiry in the number of cases that will need to be, that there is a developed process where those cases are reopened, where justice is given to the families, where there's resources provided for that, as well as long-term oversight to ensure there's implementation. And we know that's going to require commitments in budgets. And this is about upstream investments. This is about making sure that we're investing now.
Mr. Chair, if I can, and you succinctly answered my first question, but I'd like to know more about the mechanisms that need to be in place to ensure that funding, that financial accountability, if we will, gets to where it's supposed to get to.
Absolutely. I think we can get back to you with some concrete answers in terms of specifics, but I think one of the most important things is that organizations such as the Native Women's Association of Canada, such as the human rights, the arm's length, those watchdogs who have brought attention to this issue, that they are going to have to be part of oversight moving forward, so that it's somebody who is genuinely arm's length, because that independence is really important. If you are 100% in a department of the government, it cannot be independent enough to ensure that the hard questions are being asked and to ensure that the long-term strategies are put in place. So we can get back to you on the specifics of legal processes, because that's not my forte, but it's all about independent civic society oversight. And that includes not only the implementation of the recommendations, but that also includes oversight of, it's been very clear, of policing issues, of the complaints that are going to come forward, to see that they're not just identified for a nice story and it doesn't become just a record of tragedies, but that there's a commitment to do something about these, and that independent oversight makes sure that happens, but which again requires budgets.
Thanks. We're done there, actually, Todd. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Lavelle Harvard and Mr. Peters, for sharing your time with us and your knowledge, and for teaching us today. Your passion and your focus underline the importance of the issues facing Native Aboriginal women in Canada. Thank you. And with that, could I ask for a motion to adjourn? So moved. We're adjourned. Thank you.